Hi, and welcome. Navigating to an uncertain future comes with a range of emotions. So today on Futurist Mom, we're talking about something most parents are feeling but rarely name: grief for a future that may not be possible. Many of us as parents imagined a certain world for our kids with stable careers, predictable paths, usually hoping for an even better version of what we experienced. But that future is changing, or in some cases, maybe already gone. Climate uncertainty, economic shifts, technological disruption, social upheaval, or what work may or may not even look like. The world our children are inheriting looks nothing like the one we expected to give them, and we're feeling it. We may not call it grief, but the disappointment, the anxiety, the sense of loss, it's real. And the question is, what do we do with it? And how can we also allow joy to flow? Our guest, Juli has spent her career at the intersection of two seemingly opposite fields. She's both a professional futurist and a death doula, which makes her uniquely qualified to guide us through what she calls futurist death, the grief that comes when the future we envision fundamentally changes or dies. She holds an MS in foresight and a master's certificate in thanatology, which is the study of death and dying. Juli also teaches foresight thinking to both graduate students and to middle schoolers. She helps young people, including her own young daughter, learn to think and to crucially feel into many possible futures, building the capacity to navigate uncertainty with both realism and hope. Today, Juli will help us understand the grief we're carrying, why it matters to process it, and how we can hold both loss and possibility as we guide our children to a future we can't fully predict, but that they certainly have feelings about. Welcome to the Futurist Mom, Juli. I am so excited we finally get to meet each other in this space.
Yes, glad to finally connect, not online, at least a little bit of face, being able to see each other.
I have been so interested in your work for a long time. As I mentioned, I first came across you and found out more about you in an essay that I think very beginning of last year, probably January of 2025, a mutual friend of ours, Stephen Litchi, who is a futurist in Kenya, had written about his perspective on grief and the future and how to navigate it. And he had an amazing quote in there around this concept of hospicing the future. So as a person who is a very enthusiastic advocate slash cheerleader for what is possible ahead and believes that we have an opportunity to redesign this so much better for everyone, that really struck me because I think I hadn't really stopped in that moment and thought about it that way. So as I just read in your intro, you have this fascinating background that is death doula and futurist and educator. So I am curious as we start, what came first?
Yeah. Thanks for letting me be here and thanks for letting me chat about this. I think they're topics that most people don't want to jump into. So thanks for being brave and for taking this on. I love that you have the personality type and of the disposition that we want to dive into this. So thanks for offering that. As far as my personal background, in 2017, I had a younger sister and she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And that was not on my bingo card, which is what we're going to talk about today, is that expecting the unexpected. And she became ill and moved to Houston to live with us and went through treatment at MD Anderson. She had the best care that could be provided. She had access that a lot of people don't have. She was supported. She was actually a professor at a college as well. And they fully supported her. She stayed with us and she died. And that's not how we wanted it to go, but that's what happened. And so for the next couple of years, I started to reach out to other people. I had navigated that death myself of my younger sister. She was 30 at the time, and saw people around me that flailed, when death came about and didn't know what to do and hadn't prepared. And so I just started talking to people, discovered ecology, the study of death and dying, and decided that not only did I want to get the practical work of becoming a death doula, but I also wanted to understand the more cultural, psychological, emotional side of dying, not just the medical or the physical. Then I was also, at the same time, was also studying foresight at the University of Houston. And while we're having these conversations about the future, about potential clients and people you'll come across in your life, I realized that grief shows up in a very similar way to when you're having a diagnosis conversation or when you're having a conversation about someone dying. And so a heavy beginning for sure with the death of my younger sister, but I think it led and has integrated so well with talking about what might be possible and what gets in the way of what might be possible.
Wow. I didn't mean to like throw such a big question at you to begin with, but I do think that to your point, it is such a phase of life and a phase of this whole society that we are so, so uncomfortable with. And that increasingly there's a whole nother conversation we could be having about how society views death, and certainly in the United States, and how we can all navigate that with great deal more compassion and empathy and courage all the way around. But I thought what was fascinating in this conversation is how you then applied it to your foresight work, right? And you really helped us think about the fact that there's this vision of what we thought was going to happen, how it was supposed to turn out. And when it doesn't become that, we have to go through this conversation and this process. So how does that show up in your foresight work now? Are you a practicing strategist or mostly educator?
Yes, I do both. I get to serve on project teams and help lead folks, and doing a conference later in a few months of like taking people through causal layer analysis and with their organization. And so trying to pull as many tools from the field as possible. And also obviously heavily relying upon the framework that we have at Houston. But with Foresight professionally, I work with clients, but I also teach. And so I get the best of both worlds, I think. And I teach at the university, but I also teach middle schoolers, and it's really taking all of that graduate level work and then kind of de elevating it down and saying there's absolutely no reason why those of you in middle school can't be thinking about these things. And so when I'm talking to kiddos or when I'm talking to grown adults in grad school or working with clients, there's these moments of real excitement and energy around what might be possible. And there is, I think if you're good at your work, then you have some conversations with gravity that say, now, if you get everything you ever want, who loses? And what's on the other side of getting everything you ever want? And sometimes that means things fall apart. And so how do we have a conversation that is not just about us and how we survive that, but also how we help the world survive and the earth and each other? And so I think taking someone through the shock, culture, a future shock, great book of talking about how people emotionally react to the future. I think being able to sit with someone is like helping them work through grief and the ability to emotionally overcome that to move forward.
So I would imagine the way that a middle schooler processes grief around the future is different than an adult does, or as a parent. I mean, I think this is a really relevant conversation for parents in particular, because it's not just about our own, sense of what I thought my retirement was going to look like, or my career was going to look like, or anything like that. But now you're also projecting all of these expectations and hopes and responsibilities that you have to ensure that your child has a beautiful life, and recalibrating that in real time and navigating that. And we're seeing so many parents feeling overwhelmed by that, or confused by that, or not know how to have the conversation around that. So let's start with the corporate work and then work our way to parents and then to young kids. I think that might be the way to do it. In the world in which you're doing your foresight work with professionals and you go through this conversation around grief, how accessible is that for
Yeah.
people?
Yeah. I think I'm often just curious of when emotion shows up. So when we're teaching the graduate students, one lesson that I learned early on was follow the emotion. And so when you're speaking to people about the future, if they're glazed over or they act like this is no big deal, then we probably haven't reached far enough. We're probably talking more like strategic planning, something very close and maybe not as far reaching as we do in futures work and foresight. And so often when people have an emotional reaction, I'll get curious and say, tell me what's going on. And so to use a loose example, was working with a group, and when we were talking about the future of AI, which has been, definitely a hot topic over the past, this was probably 3 or 4 years ago, we were talking about the onset, and one of the gentlemen in the room tossed his phone on the table, and he said, "Well, this is what's wrong." And I leaned in and I said, "Tell me more. What do you mean that this is what's wrong when we're talking about AI?" And he went on to tell me about how, even when he's talking with his grandkids, that the phones are getting in the way, and he feels like technology is getting in the way of relationships. And as I stuck with him and stayed with him in the conversation and let everyone else kind of participate at the level he chose, was able to get to the point where it wasn't really about the phone. It was about disconnection. It was about legacy. It was about grieving his separation with his grandkids. And I didn't say that outright, like, hey, I think you're actually grieving and maybe we should have a chat. It was just helping him, getting him through that of like, maybe it's not actually the phone that you're mad about. And so usually I just lean in with a lot of curiosity and can do some of those conversations without naming it quite so blatantly, because I think people are afraid of the word grief. I think that we have been taught to avoid negative emotions, especially I think as parents raising children. And so using words like grief or anger or disappointment feels yucky.
When you say we haven't gone deep enough as foresight professionals, I'm like looking across my work and thinking that I probably have not held the space for the kind of emotional range that you have. But my experience has been the more that I start to think about the things that can be changed and I go into history and see how we sort of got here, I have been really, really angry and had to process a significant amount of how did we get here, right? And the unfairness and the injustice that was built into so many of the systems and the things that we're looking at, which is why I think I look at the future as an opportunity to shift and to change that. And I was processing a lot of that when I was in Costa Rica with a group of really special people a couple of years ago. And we ended up having a really intense grief ceremony.
Yeah.
And it was a place for everybody to really, literally wail. And I would say it was 12 women, 5 men. The men were more supportive. So it was really a women's grief circle and name it. And it was fascinating to see how, first we just felt it about so many of the things that were breaking down or so many of the things that we were losing as a society or losing as a nature. And then people started to name it. And it was, again, this pylon of things that people were feeling as we're seeing the crime in Minnesota, or we're seeing what's happening with various species, or we're seeing, the injustice of things that are happening to indigenous culture. I mean, we could just go on and on, right, about the things that we think are breaking down. So in terms of being able to then navigate that, is one of your suggestions, or I guess if you could imagine that, sort of the healthiest world, that there would be places where people could have these conversations with this kind of intensity that I was gifted with being able to go do?
Yeah, I think ritualizing this is one of the best things that we can do as community. And I think of community as lots of different ways, right? Community can be in person, it can be online. I think community online is getting harder and harder right now when we, don't have any bots we're interacting with and things. But being able to see people, I think talks like this of being able to share with a friend and say, hey, friend, I just listened to this amazing thing. I think it can spur some really great conversation with us. But I think the ritualizing of it to me is what I've spent this past year looking at. I'll get to do a talk at South by Southwest, which is a conference in Austin in March. And it's about ritualizing grief and joy. And it's about how do we do this together. And I think a lot of what we have done has been really self oriented. And I think you do have to have a really strong handle and a really clear sense of self to do a lot of great work in the world. But I think that, when we talk about self regulation, self awareness, self control, so much of it is focused on the individual and not on the collective together. And we are stronger when we have people to do this work with. And so making ritual, whether it's an individual ritual, but also collective ritual, I think is super important. And some cultures do this really well. Historically, if you look in the past, we have, and I try to integrate a lot of that in my own work of saying, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are beautiful cultures like the one you got to participate in that really speak to how to do this. And I think that part of the joy of living in a place like America is just how vastly different we all are, and finding ways of saying, and yet we are the same. And this is where we can co-regulate and co-experience and do things as a collective, not just an individual. And so I love that you're on the front end of getting to do those types of experiences like you did in Costa Rica.
Yeah, it was really interesting. We'll talk more about it, I think, later in the conversation, because it really does talk to this conversation about grief and joy and how symbiotic those two things
Yeah.
are. And when you don't let yourself feel one, you sort of, you cap off the other, which I think is a really, really important thing that that's part of the reason I wanted to reach out to you now. I just saw your post around that dance the other day and I wanted to dig into it. But when we talk again through the lens of parents or young adults or even students, and they might be listening to this or thinking about this idea of hospicing the future, we can go back to, like, again, we're seeing, is it mostly just the news that we're seeing and we're feeling helpless to being able to go do something around that? Or is it also about projecting into the future and being so unsure about what it is we can rely on now? Like,
Yeah.
where do you see the grief really centered?
I think you're right. I think so. Article I wrote last year is hospice vigil compost. And so starting with this idea of hospicing and saying first when you hospice you acknowledge that something is dying. And so when we look around us and we see things falling apart, like first you just have to name it and say, "Hey, I don't like how this is going." And something feels like it either needs some intervention or it needs to be let go. And both of those, I have a story. My parents, it's Thanksgiving a few years ago. We're getting ready, they're busy in the kitchen, and I look over and their cat has stopped eating and drinking. And they're keep trying to shove food in his little face and try to help him revive. And finally I looked at my parents and I said, "So your cat's in VSED," which is where he has decided to stop eating and drinking. And if that's okay, we can all be here together and we can let the cat die together, and that can be really beautiful. And obviously this is a holiday. And I said, if you don't want that, then you need to do something right now. And so, do you want to take the cat? And so they left the house. They took him to an emergency vet clinic. They got him healthy, and he lived another 2 weeks. And they were able to have the type of closure that they wanted to have. And so that was a place where I think they had a choice, right? And I think in a lot of places right now we have some choices of, do we want to intervene, or is it time to let something go? And that's not always completely clear in the moment. Sometimes you can look back and see those things a little clearer. I think hospicing is the moment where we see those things and we name them and we say, I think, right now there's this debate about whether we actually are in late stage capitalism. Are we actually there, right? Are the signs pointing us there? And if that's true, what does that mean? And so we're negotiating, we're doing, all the stages of grief, we're negotiating, we're in denial, we're doing all those things, and we have a choice. Vigiling is where we actually say, I know that this is dying and I'm willing to sit here and be still with it. And just like when we vigil bedside for someone who's dying, that can take a great length of time. Dying different than a birth doula. When the baby's coming, you generally have a couple of weeks window. Death is not like that. And sometimes it can take a long time. And so I think for me, I would say we're like in between the hospice and vigil. Some of us have really signed on that things need to be different and we're ready to iterate and we're ready to have change. And some of us are still negotiating whether we want to intervene in a different kind of way.
Do you think that part of this, I mean, fascinating again to take that model and apply it to the ways that we're seeing the world shift. And again, on a day-to-day parents basis, I'm not even sure if they're thinking about late stage capitalism the way that
Yeah,
you and I
right.
are.
Sure.
They're just looking at it as saying, you know what, I thought my child was going to go to college
Yep.
and now may not be going to college. I thought they were going to have this kind of career. I thought they were going to be able to move out of the house. I thought that if I, gave them access to these 17 things, that they would be really well prepared for the future. Maybe none of those things matter anymore. Like, I think that is
Yeah.
the conversation. So I think there's just more of a trying to make sense of are we even in a hospice,
Sure.
you know, stage yet? I don't know
Yeah.
what comes pre-hospice, but things don't
Yeah.
look great and they don't look the way, or maybe they just look different. I think maybe the
Right.
difference here, Maria, I'm trying to really figure out this idea of hospicing is because something is shifting and changing, but it's not necessarily
Yeah.
like the death of a person where you're
Yep.
losing this person forever, right? You're losing a construct, a way in which it was shaped, and it can be then transmuted or transitioned into something that could actually work so much better. There's all those wonderfully inspiring quotes that if I'd gotten everything that I'd wanted, it would have been awful.
Yeah.
Because the things that I didn't even know I wanted were
Yeah.
being, birthed out of that experience. So I think again, this idea of walking through the world trying to make sense of the change that we're in and thinking through your model around hospice vigil. And then what was the next one?
Compost.
Compost. There's another friend of mine, a futurist, who's using a lot of this
Yeah.
conversation around compost. Maybe talk about compost for a minute. I'm curious about that.
Yeah, so compost, we often, if you've ever had a compost heap, which I have, again, can be rather yucky. And we don't like to look at it. We don't like to look at something falling apart. Like I talk often with especially moms and parents about like the grief of our bodies. Like watching ourselves get older and the grief of aging. And I think we especially here in the States, we are repelled by that. And seeing something compost means like literally letting it decompose into something new and allowing ourselves, like our inner work, our social work, to decompose feels like we're giving up. It feels like loss. It feels like losing. And I'll often talk about like sustainability, that when we have like risen sustainability as if this is the goal, is that we would keep things sustainable instead of letting them iterate and saying, we talk about sustainable buildings, sustainable clothing. We talk about sometimes building something that lasts forever. And rather than saying maybe that's not the right way to go about it, it's to think of it as iterating. And so I think as parents, we have things that have happened like that in our lives. We've left workplaces and left friendships and moved on to new workplaces with new friendships. And we had this moment of like, we'll stay connected forever, or I'll stay friends with my college friends forever. And the reality is that's not real. And the same with, even our own relationships, our friendships and our marriages, and giving ourselves permission to be honest about the things that we want in the world. We change jobs, we change careers, and that's becoming more and more frequent. And so yeah, I think like you're saying, when we look towards the future, when I work with clients, they will often say, I prefer the like baseline future of like it's going to stay just like how it is now, just maybe like with a couple more robots or something, like we want it to stay. And we'll always say, that's the only one that won't be possible. That is the only future that is not possible, is that these would stay the same. And we've seen that with COVID. We've seen that, with the pandemic. We've seen that with lots of places where it was unexpected and changed, and we had to pivot quickly. And as adults, I think we sometimes do that well, and then sometimes we don't do it well. And that's part of what we're working on.
Yeah, I think that that's just so interesting if you and I were on a strategic project together or in a parent group together, even, right? The space that you hold for helping people really like go or navigate or make sense of the things that they're losing, and this like ridiculous enthusiasm that I have for imagining all that can get better as a result of the situation we're in. I'm looking at a world in which there was so much inequality and so much missed opportunity, and such an ability to be able to produce and to distribute so much more equitably for prosperity for all. Like I look at all these things, right? And then I'm having a harder time really getting kind of deeply connected to the sadness of loss. I get connected to the missed opportunities part of this part, and realizing how unfair it was that people had to work so hard to try just to get to equal. So that part I'm very connected to, but the loss and grief part I'm not. So I guess as you're walking through most of your world, both as again as instructor, strategist, and a empathetic human, is everyone holding this and just not naming it? Am I just deeply out of touch because I'm not spending a lot of time like mourning what it is that we are losing? Have I just not gotten really clear that, I've told my kids, I'm like, this big, huge house that you guys grew up in, just that's not how the future is going to go, right? This is going to be considered a giant waste of real estate. This much water that gets used for blah, blah, blah. Like sort of preparing them for the fact that things are going to change and their life is going to look different, which I don't think is bad. I think that it could open up all kinds of other opportunities. Is everybody feeling this and I'm just in denial?
Yeah, I think we are. I think that the scariest part to me is when we head into resignation and we become resigned, like a giving in to despair. And so when I interact with people, like I mentioned, the fellow who was angry about his phone, I would much rather have you be emotionally responsive to the conversation than have you be shut down, right? And so when I do see someone who, whether it's a parent, a student, a client, if they are shut down, trying to figure out what will provoke them into care, right? Like you clearly care about being here. You're here. You're in the room. And so what is it? What it's just like with kids, like when we do behavioral stuff, we talk about what's your currency. Every kid's got a currency. Everybody has something they care about. And so I think it's provoking that from them. It's getting them to latch on to that. But I think a lot of what we do with any sort of emotion is do you feel safe enough to feel your feelings, to get present to your feelings? But then also, are you willing to see them? Have you gotten still in your life in a way that you can even get present to them? And I think a lot of people were so overstimulated that we are saturated and running on survival mode. Even if your basic needs are met, we're running in survival mode because we feel threatened. And so I think for a lot of people, because we're in that survival mode, some people call it functional freeze, some people call it intellectualization, lots of psychological terms for what it is. But when we're in that space, we don't slow down enough to catch up with how we're feeling. And so I think a lot of folks are really pushing mindfulness, really pushing meditation, really pushing community because they see that those are moments where that might rise to the surface. And I don't think it can happen in like an hour. I think it's something that you have to ritualize. I think it's something that you have to spend time with getting present to. And so often it will show up in anger. Like we'll see, dialogue online. You'll see it in either, checking out, like I'm just going to check myself out, or checking into privilege and saying, I'm just not going to get online because I don't want to feel any of that. I don't want to see any of that. And so I look for that sort of narrative and try to seek those out and try to really help people see what's actually happening in those moments, that it's not that you're checking out because you're overwhelmed. I think it's checking out because you're not ready to feel all of that yet. And that can be okay. Sometimes we have to survive. I want to give permission for that too.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, when things were going on at the border and we were separating children from
Yeah.
families, I just was like, you know what? I have hit empathy overload.
Yeah.
There continues to be so much that it was hard to imagine feeling, more pain and more
Yeah.
suffering on behalf of those families and behalf of then, I mean, we could go through the list of all the things that we could get very
And I think that
sad about and overwhelmed by.
I think that's like the ritualization of joy as well, right? Like grief isn't the end. And so I think when people feel that, they feel like they can't also feel the height of joy, to the depth of grief, to the height of joy.
Right.
And I think you have to remind people that sometimes you have permission. And I will often say joy is not frivolous. I think that's a phrase that's catching on. Joy is not frivolous. You are allowed to have all of that. I know you care passionately about joy, and I think you have to give people permission. I find it with kids all the time. We have to give them permission. They're taking their cues from us. And if their parents aren't allowing themselves to play and to feel joy and to celebrate life, then they don't feel they have permission. And if they don't, equally, conversely, if they don't see their parents sharing openly at an appropriate level of what's going on and the feelings that they're feeling, then they also don't get access to that.
Right. I am like smiling because the fact that I'm so like attached to joy, because I don't know that I've always been that way. I've been hopeful and optimistic, but joy is different
Yeah.
to me than those two feelings. And I think that for many years, actually, I ran around with survivor's guilt, going, how come my life is still like so good? And, and I live in a safe community and my children are thriving and everything is going really, really well. And I look so much at suffering around me and carry this disproportionate weight. I should say disproportionate. I mean, I still feel like it's true, right? If I am not carrying the burdens that 99% of other people are carrying, and we can go through all that list, right? I don't have a person with a chronic disease in my family. I'm not on the bank of bankruptcy. No one has an addiction. My children are happy and thriving. No one's about to fire me, etc. Then I felt like I want to go carry more of the weight
Yeah.
and relieve other people of that weight. And so I don't know that I allowed myself joy. I allowed myself hope and optimism, but not necessarily joy. And I will say, when I did that grief ceremony and we literally like wailed for an hour and a half, and it started because someone put their hand on my shoulders and said, "You don't need to carry this alone anymore." And that's when it broke open for
Yeah.
me. And being able to be in a space where other people were naming the things that they could also see that were happening. And I didn't feel like I was the only one who could see it and the only one who had to try and solve for it was such an amazing relief, right? This is back to your conversation around community and being able to share this in space, because there are certain things that people were feeling that I actually wasn't. And at one point, actually, in the ceremony, people started naming things and I stopped crying. And I thought to myself, well, gosh, if I just lost my heart, like they're naming these also really tragic things and I'm not crying anymore. And I'm like, no, because it's not only mine
Yeah.
to carry.
Yeah.
Right. And what an extraordinary, and and from that day, actually, I do think that joy has returned. as a result of having cleansed through the stuff that was stuck in the pipes.
Yeah. And I think when we're able to lean upon other people, like in any kind of symbiotic relationship, I think where two people are relatively equal, you're able to feel that depth and then other times be able to bring the joy. And sometimes it's just two people, right? Finding one person that you feel safe doing that with. And sometimes it's big communities like you're naming. And I think when partners or people who are in relationship friends can do that work with each other, how much we are able to experience beyond all of that. Like you can go even deeper, right? Because Nancy hasn't had some of those experiences learning how to empathize, so that in the a horrible event that something like that did happen, then folks who you can be connected with. You have seen people walk that. You have people who can hold the light at the end of the tunnel. And I think for a lot of us, we are so avoidant of, like, grit avoidant, or we've kind of walked away from using like resiliency and some of those terms because they have gotten a bit of a negative rap. But like being able to have that type of grit and capacity building, I think when those of us who feel really strong, like you might right now, have the capacity to take on some of what someone else is holding, is such a relief. And in that moment, you needed someone to do that for you. I think as parents, that's one of the best things we can do with our school communities, with each other, is be able to say, "Let me help you carry this," and it just frees us up to, like you said, experience things like joy.
It makes me think then also that the key to this polarization phenomena that continues to feel like it's going in the opposite direction of what we want it to is to allow people to feel then what it is that they want to feel, right? We talk a lot about moving into the elections and into the midterms and about economic things and, what is the right message and what is the right approach and what is the right platform. And I think a lot of it is letting people feel what they want to feel and then feeling like they're not feeling it alone. And I think that that
Yeah.
is a really, really key part of the strategy moving ahead.
Yeah. I think the last thing you want to do is censure somebody's feelings, right? The last thing that you want to do is try to dictate to them. And I think there's a way to hold a boundary. I say, like, often needs to be tethered. We need to tether our grief. And that's like, actually, I actually also have a theology background. And biblically, there were lots of communities that would tether their grief, and so that it didn't float away with them. And I think that that can be applied in a lot of places, of saying, I want to be able to feel these feelings, and I need to be able to show up like a parent, and I need to be able to do my job, and I need to be able, and that's not compartmentalization as much as it is saying, I need someone to help me come back to myself and come back to my body. And there are lots of really great skills for that. You've had some guests that talk about box breathing, or talk about, grounding exercises, just laying on the ground, and pulling yourself back to your body. And so I think there's lots of ways of doing that. But collectively, when we sit across from someone who is so opposed, and that's happening in families, like political grief is a huge thing right now, of we can't even talk to each other, right? We can't even speak to each other, and I don't even know how to be in relationship with you when you vote a certain way. And I think in some ways that's, I see the legitimacy. People are being harmed, right? People are dying. And so there's some legitimacy to setting boundaries, for sure. And I'm not quite sure that we ever begin to change without relationship. I'm not sure that until you are confronted with some of this, that you can't get access to empathy and things like that. And so the loss that we feel online right now, especially, but in our communities, I think is a huge place where parents especially need to be setting an example of, here's how we be connected. Cutoff is not an option. It doesn't help us grow. It doesn't help us thrive to be cut off from each other. And so how do we do that? And man, that might be the hardest work we ever do. And
Yeah, I was gonna say,
not saying
I'll
I'm,
try and that I'm the world's greatest role model for that one. With it, because also like within danger, like I,
yeah,
left relationships that were dangerous.
yeah,
All right, so shifting to the foresight work that you do with middle school students,
yeah,
I'm super, super interested in that, right? So part of it is like, we've talked about the emotional terrain with which it is that we try and navigate the world that we're in. And so again, I'm curious what some of the things that kids are feeling
yeah.
right now as you get to do this work in such a dual capacity with them. And then I'm curious about their stories that they tell themselves about the future.
Yeah, I have an 11-year-old, And my daughter actually took my class at school, and she was like, "Your class is so hard." I said, "Yeah, of course it is. It's like it's grad school, my friend, you know." And so I think it is hard work, right? Like this is maybe not as fun as like some other things, but I think they get into it once they get there. And so when we do the foresight work at school, when we do futures thinking is the name of the class. When we do it, we teach them how to research, right? Like first is just media literacy. Like how do I figure out what's happening in the world in a way that is as unbiased as possible. And that's very hard right now. One of the phrases I hear with middle schoolers all the time is that's AI. That's AI. And they're saying it not just online, they're saying it to each other. Like when they think they're lying, that's AI. And we're a big study that we're working on right now is looking at how students are pulling themselves away from their digital lives because they can't tell what's real. And and if you're looking at something like social media, what happens in the vacuum of that, right? Like we're still using technology as pacification. You know, these students that I have, they're still scrolling, right? Nothing is stopping them from scrolling, but they're not as invested online as they once were. They're not creating. They're not looking for specialized content. You know, they're just kind of mindlessly scrolling. And so when they come to the class, I'll talk to them about, you know, what is a good way because I find signals online. I find signals on TikTok or Reddit or like threads like that. You know, I'm looking to see what people are talking about. And is it a bot? Is it a bot? You know, is it a real person that's even having these discussions in these chat rooms or places I find? And so teaching kids how to do media literacy is a first point, and then how to do really good research of saying, you know, look beyond the major headlines, look beyond where are we finding our what we call, you know, weak signals. You know, where are you finding these signals? What conversations are you having at baseball games? Or what conversations are you having when you go to a concert? You know, what are people talking about? And, you know, that's what we tell our grad students too, right? Like go to the back rooms at conferences. Don't go to the front. You know, go listen to like what's not being said or is being hidden, you know, those types of things. And so for them, it's starting off and just researching, and I'll let them pick any topic, right? Getting them enrolled in the future is helping them pick a topic they want. So if it's baseball, it's baseball. If it's animals, it's animals. And saying, great. I had a group of girls, they did fashion. And along the way, they started to realize fast fashion and how detrimental it was. And they walked away. It's like, you know, it's changed for a little while, I hope, around what the fashion industry is up to and how that's going. And when they talked about possibilities of like using mycelium, you know, to create clothing, you know, and dissolvable clothing and, you know, things like that. And so being able to do good research is part of it. But what kids are so amazing at is the second half, right? Like the real, how do you touch? How do you taste? How do you smell the future? And how do you get access to it? And they're so creative when you give them full license, you know, whatever you want to do. Imagine anything. We're doing the time machine, you know, you're stepping through. And they're just so wickedly creative. I had some kids, they're softball players and they super care about softball. And so they made these gel lines. They used like hair gel on the inside of their softball jerseys. And they did like gel lines of climate moderation like outfit like suits for them to wear in as their uniforms, and they like totally were, you know, wore them out and showed everybody when they did their kind of crafting of the future. And so I think with kids it's like such fun research, but it's also their imaginations. They feel safe enough to imagine in a way that adults sometimes don't.
My version is I went to, when my daughter was in middle school, to career day. I was invited to come give a talk about what I do. But I was like, I was very excited and I was describing various things. And the kids were like, oh, robots are going to take over all that. Oh, no, AI is going to take over all that. Oh, no, there was like really no reason to dream into the future because all can be taken over by these other entities or, you know, it'll be destroyed by the climate. And I thought, oh my God, that's so cynical. And oh my God, that was so sad. And that sense of futility, right? And so I think this work of, I don't even know if they would describe it as grieving the future, but robbing themselves of even being able to dream into the future,
Yeah.
right? Which is why the work I think that you're doing is so important because it's not just about like, okay, let's just pull out like, you know, a blank sheet of paper and imagine what you want the world to look like, but
Right.
you're giving them more framing around how to become confident observers and builders of the
Yeah.
future, which I think is huge.
Yeah, I think it's like any other skill set, like any other skill set. And so we have degrees in it. You can get this type of education. And the other class I teach is systems thinking, and it's teaching kids how to see the shape of a system. The other day we were talking about the different types of archetypes. There's like the archetype of success to the successful, and saying, when you have two basketball teams and one has lots of resources and the other doesn't, why is one more successful than the other? And when you talk about escalation, and when certain systems continue to escalate, where's the intervention? When do you know when to intervene in an escalation? And so using lots of examples that they have easy access to in their lives. And I think that helps them. Danella Meadows, in her Limits to Growth and Leverages of Change, or leverage points, she talks about ways to intervene and where. And so it's teaching kids and saying, there is hope. There are places to put your pressure on and to get in action around, and saying things like, when you look at a system and you look at the rules of the system, or the power play, who holds the power in the system, and working to change that. And I think that speaks to local governments and state level government, and saying, the way we do this is we get behind candidates and people that we really trust. And so I think the futures thinking is beautiful and has its own skill set and research, and it's not just pie in the sky and we're making this stuff up, but there are data and trends, and so much data and research. That's the part that I think they love the most, is all the research and seeing just what's happening in the world. But then it's also saying, what do we do about it? Right. And I think that's, as futurists, that's our work, is to say, it's one thing to know all these trends and to see how they interact with one another, but then it's to say, what do we do? What do you want to do? And so with the kids, I give them full license to say, if you could envision a world, what would you do? And sometimes their answers are scary. Sometimes they're scary. And I let the group kind of say, and be able to say, maybe not, maybe that's not the best option. And they have a lot more wisdom, I think, than we think sometimes.
Why would they create a scary future? Because that's what they anticipate it might be?
Think in the imagination space, they are more willing to name things that maybe we're less. It's almost as
Mm.
if we name it, we breathe life into it. One of the groups was doing a project, and we were doing implications and saying, like, if this change happens, what happens next? And it's a super fun game to play with them, because they just go nuts, and adults struggle with this, right? And we were talking about the future of health, and about health and medicine, and we were using the example of having a heart monitor. And what it eventually led to, what if the robots take over the heart monitors? What if they're using our internal devices to control us, right? And this is one, it's in scary movies, it's in sci-fi movies, right? And the kids, they started to talk to each other about, why would someone do that? Right? Why would someone take other people's agency away? And why would you even say that? Why would you even say that somebody wanted to do that? And what a beautiful conversation came out of it, of saying, yeah, why would somebody? Why would somebody want to do that? And how do you prevent around giving people too much power to do something like that? And what might you do if something like that were to happen? And so it just leads to, like, really wonderful conversations, even though they're willing to go kind of dark with it.
Wow. I love that, again, that you can hold the space for the full ride of that conversation. Because I think, again, as parents, I mean, I will say, probably not surprisingly, given this conversation, that when those conversations have come up in my world, it is hard to let your child fully express the fears around all the things that could go wrong, or that they're seeing actually go wrong. I talk a lot about the reason I still keep all these alerts on my phone around these really breaking news headlines, is because I know that my 22-year-old daughter is also reading every single one of those headlines. And I want to have a sense of what she's experiencing with the much more limited world knowledge, right? She's only been around the planet for 20 something years versus mine, and trying to make sense of it. And so I think there's a lot that we're holding ourselves as parents, and a lot that we're holding on behalf of our spouses and our parents, and our teammates and our community and our children. And I think that that is particularly a rough role, to try and keep everybody grounded, right? And keep everyone feeling hopeful around this in this moment in time. So as we wind down, again, we could talk about this for hours, and hopefully someday you and I will be in the same spot and we can have a cup of tea.
Absolutely.
So you've got your 11-year-old, and you imagine her future and the way that she talks about it. Is there anything that you are grieving
Yeah.
about her world as you look ahead?
Yeah. I
And
think
have you made peace with it?
Yeah, I think certainly the environment is pretty paramount. I live in Houston, and just this weekend we had to cancel school because the grid may fail in Texas, and we were worried about that happening again because it happened a few years ago. We have survived lots of emotional turmoil here in Houston, and so I think the reality that is just truth for where we live. Do we pick up? Do we have the privilege of picking up and just moving somewhere else where that's not the same? Or do we stay and be change agents in the midst of that, which is harder work, I think. And again, no judgment on people who make those decisions. It's just not one we've made. I think too about relationships and about them allowing themselves to be self-expressed. My daughter's at an age where kids are figuring themselves out. They're figuring out gender and sexuality, and I think allowing them the space. Sometimes when we hold so tightly to like our what we believe should be right can strangle them. And sometimes when we just allow things a little bit of breathing room, our kids will come to things much easier than we think they will. We think we must control it, and the truth is they have the space to navigate it. I think too, with online life of wondering what education will look like, you think about how slow, education is such an industry that moves so slowly. Advice to give to students is, what industry should I go into? What should I be thinking about? And with the dawn of AI, or the redawn, and the newest iteration of it, telling kids, what one of the best things you can do is double down on the humanities, and double down on social sciences, and double down on just understanding people, because yes, AI will be able to read your face so quickly, but can it see your perspective? Can it hold weighted perspectives simultaneously? Can it? There's so many things that it can't do. And so I think looking at their future education is definitely something for me that I think. I love education. I teach everywhere. And maybe the way we've done school needs to shift. And I think that's actively happening right now.
I think so too. Again, and to your point, there's we are actively driving it, or it's happening to us
Yeah.
at the same time. And so I think that that's a big part of it. So for me, it's like, where do you have us either a sense of agency or a sense of anticipation? I do say again, I think that my again, my daughter teases that I don't have a lot of anxiety. I sleep really well at night. I don't. I've never, thank God, had a panic attack, as I hear how absolutely scary and horrible they are. And I think it's because I spend so much time anticipating and then sort of bobbing and weaving in a way where I feel like it's going to be okay. I don't want to be blindsided. And so I think that was really the intent of this podcast, is just to help parents be able to take a moment and just look up and see how the world might be taking shape. Think about it from the perspective of other people who spend a lot of time in this space, and how we each are choosing to navigate or focus or ground or build or shift or change or design our way into what comes next. And I think that your work again is so profound because it doesn't try and actively do a lot of stuff other than create space for people to feel what it is that they're feeling in it, and then give them some more active tools to be able then to start to construct what comes next.
Yeah. Yeah. And
So
there
thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's beautiful resources out there for folks, to get in touch, and communities of people, and teachers and school counselors and professional counselors. I think when parents start to feel alone in their grief, in their own selves, but especially for their kids, it can feel so lonely. And more than anything, people walking away and saying, I have resources that I can be connected to. And there are places to celebrate. There's so many places to celebrate right now is certainly something I'd hope your listeners would walk away with.
Well, so I think that, yeah, when we walk away from the fact that it's okay to feel whatever it is that you're feeling, it is great when you could do that with other people, and to be able to balance, as we said, the weight of grief with the light of joy. And I do think doing it with other people, but also like literally, honey, just like I have like Nancy's Heart music, which is like, when I just want to like turn on a great playlist and go bopping around the house with no one else around. It's
For
a
sure.
really great way to not feel so weighed down by the intensity of it or the worries about it, and get a chance to really be able to play. And whether that's AI music or regular music, I couldn't tell you. I'm
Yeah.
sure it's a bit of both in my playlist these days. But yeah, I think that there are a lot of ways that we can get better at this. And so we'll put links in with the podcast so that people can find more about your work and more about foresight as a profession, or as an area of study. I've not studied it as formally as you teach it, but my middle son did actually do a week-long program at the University of Houston and found it really
Awesome.
very insightful because he'd grown up with me as a more feral futurist, and he found it really interesting to be in a space where people had more structure and more framing around it. And now he is, part of a team that's bringing AI into an organization and doing a lot of cultural transformation work. And so I think he's finding it really helpful to have had that framing. So I think the more that we can make this a literacy that children have, even as young as middle school, maybe even younger, and be able to know that they've got ways of being able to make sense of the world, I think that's huge. So I'll become a big advocate for that work for you and for us.
Awesome.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Julie. And I can't wait to hang out together more and stay warm.
Yes, thank you. You too.